what this talk is really about, it's really kind of a high-level treatment of all the things that we've learned. You know, for those of you guys that have worked for us, you'll look at us and go, do they do that all the time? Well, you know, sometimes, right? It's like it's really tough, right? So not only have we kind of wrapped our head over the last 8 years about how to build a methodology, right? How to build a company, how to build a methodology to change, but then really like how to do this stuff at scale. You know, a lot of the things that I struggle with building Leading Agile, you guys struggle with building transformation offices within your company. How do you get leaders on board? How do you find the right people to do it? How do you get people to do the things that you want them to do? You know? And so that's really where I'm kind of at in this talk. And so what I wanted to do was to start off and, you know, my mental model of the world is we have to kind of get to a same base set of fundamentals before we can start talking about scale and change and things like that. And for anybody who's listened to me or listened to my podcasts or listened to any presentations I've done, what you'll find is that I've got a perspective on what is the right conversation to have. And so what I'm going to try to do to get us started here a little bit is to shape the conversation so we can start building a common way of talking about leading change. And to do that, we have to get through a few things. Does anybody in the room think that we are adopting Agile for the sake of adopting Agile? Is it okay to be doing Agile right, but not to be getting the business benefits from it? We make a big mental leap in this community that if I can do Scrum right, that it's gonna work. If I can do SAFe right, it's gonna work. And like what we've learned over the last 8 years, probably longer than that really, if you think about like previous experience, is that it's really more about changing the fundamentals of what the organization is and how it operates rather than just changing its process. Okay? So what I'm going to do in the first part of this is I'm going to try to break down some of that and let's get some thinking tools in place. Uh-oh. Is that on? There we go. Okay, excellent. Okay, good deal. So the question is why are we transforming? So we all just agreed that we're not adopting Agile for the sake of adopting Agile. And when I first wrote this slide, not this slide, the slide that's coming after it. When I first wrote this little sequence of slides, what I was reacting to was that everybody that I was reading about was all talking about Agile in the context of responding to change. And what I realized, I grew up in Fiserv. I was part of CheckFree before the Fiserv acquisition. I learned Agile at CheckFree and learned about Agile at scale at CheckFree, again, right before the Fiserv acquisition. And what I really realized is that most organizations weren't going to Agile to be like super innovative or super adaptive or being able to figure out all this different stuff that we talk about. What they were really going for is predictability. Can we make and meet commitments? Can we deliver with higher quality? Can we get to early ROI? Can we try to lower costs? And my slides are slightly out of sync with the clicker, so it's throwing me off here. And so those four things were like the big things that we thought about all the time. How do I get predictable? How do I get things in market faster? How do I lower my costs? How do I deliver with higher quality? And so a big thing within your transformation you have to ask yourself is, are the things that I am doing in the transformation or with the process actually leading to those business benefits? And if you don't have like really clear line of sight, then there's something broken. Last time I did a talk in Atlanta, I think it was at the version 1 offices. Am I supposed to call you guys CollabNet now? Can I just keep calling you guys version 1? You know, I'm just going to keep calling you guys version 1. I still call Rally, so we'll just call version 1. And so I was up there and I said, you know, so if you were king for a day and you could do anything you wanted in the entire company, you could flip a switch, all the money, all the time, all the executive support, all the whatever, what would you go do? Only caveat is you got to guarantee me it's going to work or I'm going to fire you kind of thing. right? What would you do? Right? Knowing that it's got to lead to predictability, quality, cost savings, early return on investment. Right? Most people don't actually have the answer to that question. So as we started working with clients, we realized that, yeah, sometimes, come on, clicker, there we go, that innovation and product fit are important too, right? We want to be able to respond to change. We want to be able to do interesting things in market, and we want to make sure that we're building the right things. So those aren't throwaway, those are really core, but I would still suggest that you need to have a hypothesis organizationally about how the kinds of changes that you propose to make are going to lead to these business benefits. Is that fair? Okay, cool. And what I want to reiterate is adopting SAFe, adopting Scrum, adopting LESS, adopting DAT, adopting whatever it is you're adopting does not guarantee these 6 things. Okay? Okay, next idea. What are we transforming? Anybody who's spent, I'm going to have to like walk over here closer to my laptop and point at this thing. There we go. Anybody who's spent any time with me, I wrote kind of a really direct piece on the blog. I don't write a whole lot anymore, not as much as I used to. Tim would absolutely love to have me write more than I actually write. But I wrote this piece about culture. And I think as Agilists, we talk about culture and changing culture quite a bit. Because when we want to put changes into organizations and we want to get people to do things, what we perceive is resistance. We perceive people that don't want to come along. And we go, man, if this culture was just more open to change, my life would be really easy. Okay? But what I'm going to suggest is that attacking culture head on is not necessarily the right way to change culture. Right? Running around and beating people over the head and saying, you need to be more agile, or that's not agile, or we're not doing agile right? You guys need to be more open to everything that I'm saying, isn't always the right way to do it, right? And so let's get back to the hypothesis thing I talked about. If we assume, if our hypothesis is that changing culture is going to improve predictability, quality, early return on investment, and cost savings, you're making a mental leap in that conversation that says if these people were just more adaptive, more open to change, then all of the problems in the organization would be fixed, right? I would suggest that that doesn't necessarily always hold true. Because you guys have architectural challenges in your organization. You guys have big monolithic systems. I've worked with a few companies in here, right? I know you guys have big monolithic systems on the back end. Being open to change, sure, right? I can be more adaptive, sure. I can run small experiments, sure. But it's that big monolith in the back that requires 3 months of regression testing that's making it really super hard to be agile. So you're hoping that if I get everybody to change their mindset, that they'll make the hard economic investments in that back office or whatever it is to be able to be more agile. That doesn't necessarily go together, okay? The next thing is let's say I come in or you guys come in and you teach yourself SAFe or Scrum or whatever. Right? The idea is if we're going to be practices focused, if we're going to start doing the things that Scrum says to do, the hypothesis is, what do we say in Scrum? Scrum doesn't fix anything, Scrum just shows you your impediments, right? So if I form a team that's not well formed, that's sitting on top of a legacy architecture that has all these kinds of problems, what's Scrum going to show me? It's going to show me I've got dependencies everywhere in the organization. So the Scrum Master's job is to go resolve impediments. Any Scrum Masters in the room? How many of you guys walked into the CIO's office and said, you know what, we really need to take this back-end architecture and like totally refactor it into microservices and put everything in the cloud? Because we want to empower the Scrum team to be awesome. Does that work? No, probably not, right? And so, but that's the hypothesis. If you train people on process, then your hypothesis is that process will expose the impediments and that the organization will work to remove the impediments. I would suggest that's not always true, right? And if your job's on the line, you're king for a day, but you only have 3 months, right, to get this thing going, it's probably not a good bet for you. Okay, so one of the things that we talk about a lot is the idea of systems. And so I've played with the word systems, structure, right? There's lots of different words. But the idea is that the fundamentals of doing Agile, whether it be something at the team level like Scrum or XP, or whether it be something at the enterprise level like SAFe or large-scale Scrum or discipline agile delivery, there is a fundamental organizational architecture that is required in order to be able to make those methodologies work. It typically revolves around encapsulated teams. It typically revolves around some sort of enterprise governance model that deals in small batches. There's some sort of requirement for getting technology aligned with the business. Right? That's what I mean by systems. And the challenge is that a culture change doesn't necessarily lead to the systems change. A process change doesn't necessarily lead to the systems change. I might even go so far to say is if I try to get you to flip your culture, but your systems are incongruent with the culture and the behaviors that we want, people are going to become very jaded because they're going to feel like they're powerless to make the changes necessary. If we put process in place that's incongruent with your structure, right? We're going to empower encapsulated teams, and we're going to use Scrum, and we're going to get market fast, and we're going to use all these processes that enable that, but yet I can't deliver anything without managing 46 external dependencies across the org, right? That process isn't going to increase your agility. So what my hypothesis is that the only thing that's going to fundamentally increase your agility is getting the organizational structure stuff right. Getting the systems in place, right? The encapsulation, the business alignment, getting the governance worked out, right? Because if you can figure out what the to-be state of your organization needs to look like to support agility, and then you can enable that with process and start to remove the impediments to agility over time, you can start to move culture. Well, it's a chicken and the egg problem, right? Well, I got to have some culture change in order to be able to do the systems change. Sure, right? But what we find is that early on, appealing to try to get somebody to change for the sake of being agile is really uphill. What you've got to do is you've got to tie these changes to the fundamental economics of the company. And if you can cost justify the changes and hold yourself accountable on the backside for actually delivering the hard economic improvements and really walk the organization through how it's going to work better in a measurable way that the CFO cares about, then you've got a shot at changing the culture. But a bunch of agilists running around saying, oh my gosh, I'm so sad because nobody's changing their minds or whatever, right? As hard as you're working at it. I don't mean to be disrespectful, but that's not a great strategy for influencing executives. Okay? So what I want to do over the next couple of slide sequences is I want to break down what does it mean to start to change and align the systems within the organization. But before we do that, what I want to talk a little bit about is the kinds of things that we need to overcome organizationally. Because as we begin to be change agents, as we begin to lead change in companies, we have to recognize that there are just different sets of concerns, right? And so the first thing is, and this is something that I think is fascinating. If I'm a startup and I've got 6 to 8 people and I want to get that team introduced to Scrum, I could probably send them the 20-page Scrum guide or send everybody to a 2-day training class, and then they're going to be transformed. Anybody sent, I've heard Coca-Cola's here, Fiserv's here, I know the Cox group's here, lots of people are here, right? You think sending people to Scrum Master training is the right transformation strategy for what you guys are trying to go through? I would suggest probably not, right? So when you're dealing with scale, when you're dealing with organizational structure at scale, when you're dealing with governance at scale, the thing that I want to acknowledge is that team level transformation, small work group transformation, single product transformation is different from enterprise transformation. And the things that you do to manage small ecosystems of teams is different from the kinds of things that you might do to manage large, complex ecosystems of teams. Is that fair? Okay, cool. I'm glad this isn't a great slide. It was way better in print. But what we've got up here is dependencies. And one of the big things, I'm on record, I've been saying this for probably over 8 years, I think dependencies kill Agile. Okay? Anytime two things are connected to each other, it limits their degrees of freedom. If I want to go to dinner by myself and I change my mind on where I want to go, no big deal. If I'm going with my wife, right, we have to at least coordinate, right? If I'm going with my in-laws, right, I got to plan 6 weeks in advance. We're going to eat at 4:30. It's always steak, right? I mean, that's the hardest dependency I've got going on in my life, right? And you don't change that. And so the kinds of dependencies, I'll read this to you. I hate to do that, but it's because, you know, it's hard to read from out there. But like non-instantly available resources, matrixed organizations, limited access to subject matter expertise, shared requirements between teams, technical debt and defects, low cohesion, tight coupling, large products with diverse technology stacks, too much work in progress. Okay? Those are the things that are getting in the way of your agility, not your ability to do Scrum. And one time I did this talk, it was in Atlanta a couple years ago with a room full of CIOs, and one guy bravely raises his hand, he goes, but yet that's like my entire organization, that's everywhere. And I go, yeah, it's your job to fix it. As a CIO, it's kind of that they lead the organization. So what we're going to say here is that in the presence of dependencies, you either have to manage dependencies or you have to break dependencies. If we're like a pure agilist and you're like, man, I want to do small team, Scrum, XP, lean startup, right? And I just totally get it because I came out of a small shop and then I go to work at Fiserv and I've got a zillion dependencies between my team and the rest of the organization. You have to manage that differently than if you're a startup. You just do, right? So you either manage dependencies or you break them. Fair? Okay, and what I didn't actually get any response. Is that fair? Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, I was wondering if like you guys are like not tracking with me on that one. Yeah, dependencies, you either manage them or you break them. I will suggest that the less dependencies you choose to break, the harder it is to get the business benefits of agility. You just won't be agile, right? The more dependencies that you can break, the better shot you have of being agile. So the work, I'm going to actually cheat up on a slide here a little bit. The work of the transformation is really breaking dependencies, my opinion. And I'm getting like just really like set on that. Another idea that I have learned viscerally over the last 10 or 12 years is that resistance comes in lots of forms and lots of different reasons. Most people aren't resistant because they're being evil. Most people are resistant because they're locally optimizing for their individual best interests. Does that make sense? And, you know, a lot of times I'll walk in, I'll say, well, how much resistance do you think there's going to be in the organization? They go, oh, there's not going to be any resistance. The CIO has funded this and has put all their weight behind it. And I go, well, what about that middle manager that's been in their place for 20 years, that knows how to do their job, that has kids in college and a mortgage to pay, and everything that you're saying to them absolutely undermines their safety in the organization? You think that person might be likely to be resistant? Yeah, right? So we have to figure out what to do with that, right? And so in front of this stage, given that I've got an hour, right, it's hard to like really talk about that, but you've got to create safety for those people. Because this is like real stuff. This is your kids in college. This is where you live. This is, you know, your respect in the community, your sense of self. And people might want to change, but they don't want to put themselves at risk. And so what we have to do as agilists, because we can see it so clearly, right? We can see how this is going to benefit us. What we have to do is we have to help the people that we're trying to get to change see how it benefits them. Not the benefits that you think they should want, but the benefits that they think that they should want. Just as a totally quick aside, and I can't do too much of this because I don't want to run out of time. But has anybody ever said to somebody, oh, this is Agile's great. You get to be able to respond to change, and you get to be able to pull requirements in and pull requirements out. But the person you're talking to is like, you know, I kind of like making these big fixed lists of requirements and making promises to my boss, and then when we fail, it's your problem. So what's in it for them, right? They either participate with you, the IT organization that never delivers anything that they want, right? And hitch their wagon to what it is you're doing, or they sit over here and blame you guys for not being able to produce anything, right? Seriously, what's better for their career? Well, I know that's a nuance, but sometimes they think it's better for their career to sit where they are. Okay, so you got to understand how to move people out of the position given the resistance that they want to demonstrate. So I'm going to pivot a little bit here. So what I want to do is, if anybody's ever heard me do this 3 things talk that I do, one of the things that I've come to believe over the last couple years specifically is that Agile is not really about adopting any kind of Agile methodology. Agile methodologies all work if you get the context right. The fundamental kind of unit of thinking to me is that in order to be Agile, I need to do 3 things. I need to have 3 things. The first thing I need are backlogs. Okay? Backlogs are going to give me clarity about what I want to do. They're going to give me an idea of what is my scope of work. Those backlogs get fed into complete cross-functional teams. Complete cross-functional teams that are working off of a known backlog can produce measurable progress, working tested software. Actually, I think I stole that slide from something. It's supposed to say working tested software on that. But the idea is teams, backlogs, working tested software. Now, what does that mean? My clicker, there we go. So a backlog isn't just any list of random stuff that a program manager or product owner wants you to do. It is a very neatly written set of stuff. It is, as a user, I want this, so I get some business benefit. It's independent, negotiable, valuable, estimatable, small, and testable. It's a card that's a placeholder for a conversation with a confirmation, right? I can estimate it. I can use story points maybe, or I can use t-shirt sizes. I can have a conversation about what it is. It's knowable. First time I did this talk, a room full of 500 Agilists at a Scrum gathering, I said, how many people have backlogs like that? How many of you guys have backlogs like that? Consistently, good, right? A few, right? We're getting better. But look at all the people in this room that are doing Agile that aren't writing backlogs that way. Teams. A team is a group of 6 to 8 people that have everything and everyone necessary to be able to deliver the product that's in the backlog, right? They have minimal dependencies. They can operate with autonomy. They can establish a stable velocity. How many organizations are forming teams like that? Loosely coupled, dedicated teams, 6 to 8 people, focused on something the business cares about. A few, right? Working tested software. Oh. How many people can get to a definition of done at the end of the sprint? Working, tested, validated, hopefully integrated, maybe even deployed every 2 weeks, right? A few, right? The rest of you guys, that's your job for the next couple years. I'm dead serious, right? Because here's the thing. The calculus of Scrum, and this is something that I learned way back in the day, because I came out of project management. And as a project manager, I was always trying to figure out, okay, time, cost, and scope. Like, this can't be a free-for-all. I asked the client a couple weeks ago, they were like, how do I get my manager to stop asking me for dates? And I went, is there ever a world in which dates aren't going to be important here? Does anybody think that like dates aren't going to be important in their company? Okay, so seriously, right? So time, cost, and scope. We know that we can fix 2, the third has to float. We know if dates are important, time's going to be fixed. If we know that cost is going to be fixed in the short run, because we can't just add infinite people, even if we have the money for them, right? We know we can't add them into the team on short order. Right, so the only thing we have to do is really to talk about how to vary scope over time. Okay? And so the idea is behind teams, backlogs, working tested software is if I know the scope in my backlog, the size of the scope in my backlog, and I know the velocity of the team, I can start to derive how much of that backlog I'm going to be able to get through, right? Or how long that backlog is going to take to complete. If you don't know what your backlog is and you can't size it, if your team does not have a stable velocity, and you aren't getting to the definition of done at the end of the sprint, I will tell you, you have no idea when your product's going to be finished. You just don't. Okay? That is the brutal reality of what we're talking about here. And in my definition, in my 8-10 years of experience of doing this, the only way to get the size of the backlog, a stable velocity, and measurable progress is to form teams like this. If you can do that, then do Scrum, do XP, do Disciplined Agile Delivery, do SAFe, do whatever, I don't care. Doesn't matter, right? They're just contextually different processes that help solve certain kinds of problems. But I will tell you, none of them work, with the exception of maybe Kanban, but that's a whole different conversation. None of them work in the absence of this. None of them are going to get you to predictability, quality, early return on investment, cost savings, innovation, or product fit, unless you do these three things. And I'm willing to go to battle over that one. So come up and talk to me afterwards if you disagree. I would love to take questions now. So the idea here is that, I'm not going to go into these slides too much, is that we need clarity on what we want to build. We need to be able to hold the teams accountable. The teams need to be able to hold themselves accountable. If you don't have clear cross-functional teams, complete cross-functional teams, one of the biggest problems is that that team can't be held accountable for anything. And they're powerless to get their work done. So nobody's accountable if you don't have complete cross-functional teams. And then the idea of measurable progress, right? If you can't stabilize velocity against a known backlog, you have no idea what kind of progress you're making. I like to anchor this in, when I have more time, into Dan Pink's stuff, autonomy, mastery, and purpose. As knowledge workers, right? What's the premise of that book, Drive? As knowledge workers, it's like we have to be paid enough to pay our bills, but at some point the work has to transcend just showing up and building widgets for a buck. Right? And so what Dan Pink talks about is this idea of autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Purpose is the backlog. Autonomy is the team. And mastery is getting to the definition of done. Right? If you don't know what it is the product owner is asking you to build and you're disconnected from the portfolio, right? How do you know what the context is? Right? If you don't have that complete cross-functional team, then you're sitting there powerless to be able to do anything about it. And therefore, you're not going to get to a definition of done, and you're just going to suck, right? It's going to feel awful coming to work every day. Okay, so teams, backlogs, working tested software. Where are we now? Okay, so one of the ideas that I've been developing since my version 1 days is I would get on the phone with clients, and I would talk about the need to be able to respond to change. And what I kind of learned was that there's this huge group of people in the world that don't want to respond to change. What they want is predictability. When you talk to your executives and say, do you think your executives want predictability or the ability to respond to change? Make and meet commitments, but I can throw anything at you I want, anytime I want. Right? They probably want both, don't they? Right? So the realization that we want to do when we're thinking about Agile and Agile transformation is this idea to recognize that predictability and the ability to change compete with each other. Is that fair? Okay, markets have a similar kind of a thing. There's a lot of companies, and companies like Google and Facebook and web-based kind of properties, right? Those things kind of come to mind in the sense that the feature set can emerge based upon our evolving understanding of the market. The other side of that spectrum are things like what I would envision to be like government contracts. Tax software, right? There's a lot of ability to inspect and adapt within that, but you kind of largely know what it is that you're trying to build. You're converging on a specific outcome. And the challenge with Agile, right, when you're trying to do Agile in a convergent kind of way, is you're using iterative and incremental delivery to be able to reduce risk and to be able to fine-tune what it is that you're building. It's not that we don't know what we want, it's just that we're using iterative and incremental delivery to fine-tune into it. And so as we started to kind of think through this, right, realize there's a little 2x2 quadrant. So when you know you're like a really professional management consultant is when you develop your own 2x2 quadrant. Okay, just want to let you know. And so in the lower left quadrant, I started writing blog posts about the idea of predictive convergent companies kind of as traditional waterfall and adaptive emergent. And my first thought was, part of the reason why we are struggling to introduce Agile ideas is because as Agilists, we tend to value the upper right quadrant, adaptive, figure it out as you go. The companies that we are in tend to value predictive convergent, right? They don't only value it, they're built for it. Anybody have like a big governance office, a big PMO in their company? Okay, come on, you guys are lying to me. Seriously? You guys have all fully deconstructed that at this point. Okay, fine, I'm not going to believe you. I just think you guys don't want to raise your hands. So there's big PMOs in these organizations, right, that are making governance decisions, right? You're built for it. The audit requirements mandate it. Okay, so what we had to do is I was thinking through, like, okay, so how would you sell Agile? How would you convince somebody in the predictive convergent quadrant that they wanted to be in the adaptive emergent quadrant? And that's a tough sell. But then once you kind of start to think about this, what I kind of realized is that it was this 2x2, and we could do these 4 quadrant things, and I started to explore what the other 2 quadrants look like. So we had this idea of the predictive emergent. I'm built for predictability. I do annual planning. I have 18-month project plans and roadmaps and all this kind of stuff. But stuff is changing around me all the time. Does that resonate with anybody? Yeah, and so as Agilists, what we say the answer to that is that we want to go to the upper right quadrant. We want to go from upper left to upper right. And a lot of times we'll run pilots in the upper right quadrant, create teams, give them clear backlogs. It's greenfield, so they have the ability to do working tested software every sprint. We exercise the processes of Scrum. Life is good, everything works. And then we take those processes, because we think it was the processes that gave us the agility, and we apply them back into our predictive emergent world. And Scrum doesn't work in that world. Okay, it's incongruent. And so what we started to think about was, what does the journey look like, right? What are the 4 different quadrants? So we have this upper left quadrant, which is I'm built for predictability, stuff's changing all around me. That tends to be very ad hoc, chaotic, heroic, irrational, insane, right? I mean, just it's interesting, right? The lower left quadrant is where traditional tends to live, right? The lower right quadrant is where Agile tends to live. Well, so how can I be adaptable but still make and meet commitments? Well, the answer to that question is smaller batches, right? We all set out when we do a sprint to deliver what we planned in the sprint planning meeting. Right? That's just, we're trying to make and meet a commitment against a fixed scope. So we fix time, we fix cost, and we're trying to hit a specific scope within that time box. Right? Because we want the ability to change, we just create more breakpoints in the system so that we can inspect and adapt and pivot, right? Upper right's a totally different game altogether. That is the quadrant of experimentation. That's the quadrant of R&D. That's the quadrant of lean startup. Okay? And so part of the conversation that we have to have is, what is the value system of the company that you're in, and what are the attributes of the organization that are going to force me to be in one quadrant or the other? Okay? And what you recognize is that different parts of the organization are going to be in different quadrants. Different parts of the organization are going to need to move to different quadrants for different reasons. Different parts of the organization are going to have different constraints based upon their technology stacks and such. So what you're going to end up is you're going to end up having to tailor your methodology around the quadrant you're in, the quadrant you want to be in, and the constraints that you're trying to overcome. More dependencies is going to force you lower left. Less dependencies, you create optionality for upper right. Right? The value system of the company and what it's trying to achieve will kind of determine the rest. Does it make sense? So basically what I've kind of done here is I've said, look, let's focus on the business value of the change. Let's make sure that we're focusing on the underlying systems associated with that. We're respectful of the scale of the organization, the nature of the dependencies, and the level of resistance. And now what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, okay, let's recognize that it's not one size fits all. Anybody in here doing SAFe? Do you guys know that SAFe is designed to be tailored? Right, the guy that spoke right before me put on there's like 4 different flavors of SAFe depending on different sizes of the organization. It's designed to be tailored even within those 4 different things of the organization, right? These are not designed to be lift and drop methodologies, right? So we have to figure that out. Go. There we go. Okay. So transformation's a journey, right? What we find often is that companies tend to start in the upper left quadrant, at least the ones that tend to call us, right? It's very chaotic. They're looking for answers. Depending upon the nature of the constraints, what we generally find is that most organizations have to go to the lower left quadrant first. That's counterintuitive. And the reason why is because you have to deal with dependencies and you have to deal with your governance issues early on. So a lot of times when I'm talking to SAFe shops, I'll say this could be SAFe, but it's like SAFe plus. right? It's more forward planning. It's more look ahead. It's more upfront dependency management. It's more intentionality. It's more focusing on stable velocity. It's more focusing on getting requirements decomposed right. Why? Because you're dealing with dependencies and you're dealing with an organization that hasn't changed yet. You want to use iterative and incremental team-based methods. You want to lay the foundation for Scrum or SAFe. But you're going to recognize that that quadrant, you are not ready for agility because you have dependencies. You have constraints. So we want to start to teach the organization to operate in a new world, but with a different wrapper around it. Okay? That's lower left quadrant. You don't want to use waterfall, obviously, so we want to use lean agile methods, but we want to achieve largely the same goals. Is that 20 minutes or is that 20 seconds? That's got to be 20 minutes. Okay. He put up like a 20, and I'm like, okay, yeah. I guess that makes sense, sitting here in front of all you guys. Okay, so the lower right quadrant, if you can start to break some of those dependencies, where I'm at here. Oh, other direction. There you go. If you can start to break some of those dependencies and actually improve the organization, you start to allow teams to operate more autonomously. They start to be more encapsulated. You can start to lighten up the orchestration. You start to do more team-based funding. Right? There's lots of things that you can do as you start to move into that lower right quadrant. And then once you have totally independent teams, some of them are going to want to go, and once they're fully decoupled, it can go and do kind of lean startup-y kinds of things. So a couple of ideas kind of tightly embedded in this. Different methodologies depending upon the attributes of the organization and the needs of the organization. A recognition that just because you want to be upper right, you can't necessarily go straight there. You might need some compensating controls in place as you're learning how to improve the organization, because you've got to either manage dependencies or break them, and we've just established that you haven't broken them yet. So we're going to manage the dependencies while they're there. And then the continuous improvement is going to be about systematically removing the impediments to Agile. This is going to be a tough question. It's going to be a tough question to raise your hand for. But does anybody believe that, that we should just empower the teams and let the teams figure this stuff out? Let them just hit all of these dependencies as they go? That's a lot of the messaging we get in Agile. Just empower the teams, teach them Scrum, teams will remove the impediments. We've established that some of these impediments are beyond their control. I would suggest that 80 to 90% of the impediments that you're going to encounter are actually knowable. You can actually go get funding to remove them in advance. You could actually, t-shirts in the room excluded, could put them on a Gantt chart and put a project plan together for removing them. They're that known. Right? This isn't like just get in and figure it out and hope for the best. We know. Okay? So removing those impediments is the work of the transformation, which is really my next slide, right? So adopting Agile, right? Doing an Agile transformation is at its absolute core about forming teams, getting to the place we can create those complete kinds of backlogs, and getting the team to a place where they can regularly produce a working tested increment of software. If you're not doing those three things, you are only going through the motions of doing Agile. Okay? Adopting Agile at scale, which is a slide sequence I took out, is about creating networks of teams organizationally, putting an adaptive Kanban-based small batch size, flow, throughput accounting type of governance on top of it, and putting in metrics and tools that actually support that kind of governance and decision making and team-based management. Version 1's one of them, right? Lots of others, AgileCraft, CA. Actually, you can even use Jira nowadays, which is kind of fascinating. And so what you want to have is you want to have metrics and tools that support agility. And the work of the transformation is anything that gets in the way of doing that. Any impediment is the work. I've walked into a lot of companies where their transformation plan was train these people, hire some Scrum Masters, make sure we have product owners in place, train the product owners, right? It's all about process introduction. And what I'm suggesting is that the core work, the critical path for all you project managers out there, the critical path is getting the organization rebuilt and dependency free. Once you have that critical path, Then you hang the training off of that, and then you start to do like the culture and mindset and responsibility and all those kinds of things. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. So last speaker I heard was like talking about using Agile to implement Agile. 100% agree with it. Using Scrum to coordinate training, while maybe interesting, isn't using Agile to adopt Agile. If you think about using Agile to adopt Agile, the work of a transformation is a transformed organization, right? The unit of value of transformation isn't training people. The unit of value of transformation is an organization that is operating with greater agility. That's just brutal reality, right? So if we recognize that the business value of the transformation is a transformed organization, our backlog has to be things that are valuable to our customers, right? So what does that backlog start to look like, right? That's kind of an interesting question, right? And so one of the things that I wanted to kind of pivot here, and then we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the overall transformation journey kinds of things. One of the things that I think is interesting, I'm rather on record just being absolutely methodology agnostic. I really don't care. We're not in bed with SAFe. We're not in bed with Scrum. We use those tools as we see fit to ours and our clients' advantage. But I was kind of like going through and thinking through like, what are all the different methodologies out there that you guys get to choose from? Waterfall, RUP, DSDM, that's one nobody's ever heard of anymore, FDD, SAFe, Disciplined Agile Delivery, LESS. Nexus, anybody trying to use Nexus? I read about it, but I don't have my head around it yet. Right? It's kind of new. Obviously Scrum, XP, Kanban, crystal clear. If anybody isn't reading Alistair Coburn, you guys got to go back and read his early stuff. Absolutely foundational to what we're doing. Lean and Lean Startup. And so if you take all the methodologies that are out there and you try to look at them in the context of the quadrants that we just talked about, there we go. That was the slide I want. I mean, this is, don't like totally like look at the positioning, but this is like roughly where I think they fit in the quadrants. So if you're shooting for super R&D, very fast, innovative, right? At levels of scale, you might look at LESS, Crystal, Lean Startups in that upper right quadrant. Down in the lower right, Nexus, SAFe, DAD, Discipline, or XP and Scrum. As you start getting into the lower left, you start to use heavier weight methodologies, right? You're starting to use FDD and DSDM. Waterfall would be in the low right, don't recommend it. RUP, probably a little too heavy implemented. Right? So that's kind of like where the methodologies fit in this. So what we've got to do is we've got to stop being dogmatic about the methodology we want, and we got to start choosing methodological elements that match the organization where it is and its constraints. And then the journey is going to be about how to deprecate some of that heavyweight stuff as we improve the system. And so any Gartner people in here, Gartner Mode 1, Gartner Mode 2? Okay, so here's just another quick angle. So what Gartner's talking about is dual speed IT. And a lot of times that gets interpreted as Agile and Waterfall. I think that's a little self-serving from some of the legacy tool vendors. What they're really saying is that for systems of record, a lot of banking people in here, right? You don't want the bank stuff to be off by even a penny. Right? We don't want to take a bunch of Agilists and throw them at a 50-year-old COBOL code base and go start deploying into production every day. Right? That would be irresponsible. Right? Back in the day, and it's probably gotten better, but we had 3-month regression cycles on the back end of that kind of thing. Right? That's really, really difficult because you've got to be right all the time. So even if you have the ecosystems in place, the environment in place, to be able to do really fast Agile, what I would suggest is that systems of record tend to need to be more intentional. Whereas things like web and mobile can tend to move faster. So what Gartner's saying with dual speed IT is we're going to slow down and we're going to be intentional about the stuff in the lower left quadrant, and we're going to speed up and we're going to go fast and take risks in the stuff in the upper right quadrant. Okay? What you're going to find, and this is just an interesting caveat to what we just talked about. So what did I say? Value system of the organization is going to help you set your quadrants. The amount of constraints within the system, number of dependencies, is going to help you set your quadrants. I would also suspect that the criticality of the system is going to help you set your quadrants, which means is that for some parts of your system, if you, let's say you want to do safe across the board, right? Cool, got it. The stuff that's in the lower left is going to need to be more plan-driven and more intentional than safe prescribes. If you're in the lower right quadrant, safe's home base, right? Fine, do safe all day long. If you need to go super fast, safe is probably overkill. Okay? So it's kind of like safe minus in the upper left, upper right, safe plus in the lower left, and then just kind of home base safe in the right. So you've got to be very thoughtful about how you apply methodologies based on the need. You're not going to find one methodology that's going to satisfy the needs of the organization, knowing that your organization is probably going to be all over the board in terms of where they're at right now. And so the journey becomes, I'm going to just flip through this, just put it all up on the slide at one time because my clicker is so not working for me right this minute. So what we've been doing, and this is where we've been evolving our practice and our thinking and work with clients a lot lately, is getting really, really clear about what the organization needs to look like and what parts of the organization need to be in what quadrants and what the journey of those different pieces of the organization is going to look like. And so we kind of coined this thing, we talk about base camps and expeditions. And so you can think of an expedition as like a product area or maybe a value stream or maybe a division, right? There's lots of different ways you can think about expeditions, but a group of teams that are going to make the journey together. And then you have to define that journey. And again, a typical kind of journey for us is I'm up in the upper left quadrant and I'm incredibly just yanked around. Requirements changing all the time, can't make and meet commitments, organizations demanding predictability, it's totally broken. Dates aren't going to change, right? So I've got to be able to solve that problem within those constraints. So what we do is we move the organization into this lower left quadrant form of agility. We recognize the need for planning, we recognize the need to respect dependencies, and we put compensating controls in. And the first thing you want to do is not to go super fast and loose, but you want to use Agile to be incredibly structured and disciplined. You're going to meet the organization where it is, and then you're going to prove that your method can out-project manage the existing project managers in Waterfall. That's what I used to do back at CheckFree. We were using Agile, doing some really interesting program portfolio management stuff. I could out-project manage my other project managers using Agile. I had more earned value metrics than they could ever dream of. I could give portfolio statistics at a drop of a hat because this is how we were managing the portfolio. But we were doing it in a much more plan-driven way. Okay? So as you start to stabilize the system, what you want to do is you want to start to think about how to lean it out and start to reduce batch size. And there's a lot of gains that can be done by just getting the organization to deliver in smaller batches, to make smaller commitments. But you can do that once you've earned that right by being able to make and meet commitments, to be able to balance capacity and demand. So then you get the organization to reduce batch size. A lot of organizations want to stop at that point because that's like way better than they've ever been, right? So we get stuck at base camp 2 occasionally when we wish we could go further, right? And then if you're going to go 2 or past base camp 3, the only way to really do that, to achieve that level of agility, is to start to decouple teams from each other. Now SAFE, what SAFE is doing is putting a planning wrapper around a group of highly dependent teams. My take on SAFE in that regard is that it's not yielding the stability, the stability of delivery throughput that most organizations demand. So you get a lot of people that are doing SAFE very well. They probably like SAFE, but it's not stabilizing throughput at the value stream or release train level. Okay? That's because largely there's not enough intentionality or prescriptiveness around how to get backlogs decomposed, and those dependencies are causing variation within the train. Okay? So you can kind of camp out on base camp 3, put some safe kinds of wrappers around it, and probably be okay. You'll be better. But if you really want to like camp out in base camp 3 with like more agility than you would have, then you need to start to decouple the teams, right? And that's where you start to get DevOps, CI/CD, right? All kinds of interesting things that a lot of us want to start with that I think are probably better to be taken care of like once you've got your organizational architecture worked out. It's kind of my bent. If you go past that, right, now what we're really doing is now we're talking about funding strategies. So Basecamp 4 for me is, can we change the governance to fund small, loosely coupled teams? In a lot of really large organizations, that's not actually products, it's actually business capabilities. And so if you can look at your organization through a business capability lens, business capabilities aligned with technology, aligned with team, you can fund business capabilities independently. Okay? So an independently funded business capability is what I'm really talking about at Basecamp 4. And then last but not least, some of those things are going to want to go to a more innovative, less project-funded kind of mode, where the teams are giving more autonomy to go solve problems based upon the needs of the market. That would be like Basecamp 5. Okay? So in closing, right? Or at least before we ask some questions and I get yanked off the stage, is the transformation journey is again, it's not about introducing Agile, and it's not about changing culture. It's about getting alignment across the organization, encapsulation, orchestration, and then putting in compensating controls to deal with the organizational dysfunction that we know is there, and then building a plan for how to deprecate or reduce that level of compensating control as the organization starts to improve and earns the trust of its business partners. And what we've learned, and we're getting better, we learned it a couple years ago, we're getting to the point where I think we can do it largely effectively at this point, is you can actually script out these engagements. And so we've been playing with the notional idea of, like, we call them outcomes-based plans. And you can say, okay, Expedition 1, you're going to go to Basecamp 2, it's going to take 6 months, here's your main milestones, stabilize throughput, reduce batch size, here's the 16 different intermediate outcomes that you have to have in order to be able to demonstrate that you're making progress. So we want to have the teams formed. We want to have their velocity stabilized. We want to make sure they're operating off of a 3 to 6 month rolling backlog, right? There's lots of different things. Now, all the training and coaching that you do underneath all rolls up to those outcomes, right? So a lot of the things that you're doing are going to be the same, but that outcomes-based set of things that are taking us to a particular base camp with the acknowledgement that it's the alignment and the breaking the dependencies and the organizational change, it's the real work, that's, to me, what enables us to be able to use Agile to be able to transform the organization. But if there's like one thing that I could get across, like just one anchoring idea for you guys for the rest of the day, is that teaching people Scrum is not enough. Being frustrated that people won't change their minds is not enough. If you guys can figure out how to script the change, and we didn't talk a whole lot about this, but make each step in the change process economically justifiable and results driven, right? Getting back to my king for a day, right? If I gave you all the agency in the world to go do whatever you needed to do, you just had to be able to prove results, right? That's what I think our executives are looking for in these things. And I can tell you, a lot of the clients that we're acquiring right now, we're walking in with this message, and it's deeply resonant with those executives, and candidly, it pulls us up into the C-suite more effectively. So how do I get my managers to buy off on my Agile transformation? Start talking to them in the language that they understand, which is money, right? Money and economics. Because that's what it takes. They're making an investment, they need to get a return on that investment. So we as Agilists have to get better at demonstrating to our leadership how we are being good stewards of the dollars that they're giving us to lead these kinds of changes. And can we connect the dots back for them and show them how that spend actually improved the company? It's a big deal, right? And it's hard. It's hard to do, it's hard to convince people. Candidly, it's hard to build a consultancy to do it. It's hard to get people, even within your consultancy, to understand. It's just challenging on every level. So I'm not saying this is easy, but I can tell you that when it works, it really, really, really works. And I think it's the answer. Any thoughts, questions? Yes, sir.
I love the presentation and the idea of the expedition and the base camp.
Yeah.
The question is, in the accounts where you use this approach, do you find in larger organizations, Coca-Cola, Monster, there's got to be teams of entire organizations at multiple base camps.
Yeah, oh, absolutely, for sure.
Comments about when you find you've got quad 1, 2, 3, 1?
Yeah, so I'm going to give you like a really short high-level answer. Sometimes as you're making the journey, so let's say you have some like core platform capabilities, okay? And then you've got more like agile inclined other capabilities within the organization. What you might find is that some of those more legacy components are going to reduce the agility of the things that are highly dependent upon them. Okay? Like I'll give you like one for example out of banking that we see all the time is if I've got a mobile app development group that can just iterate and deploy and iterate and deploy, and they are dependent upon a legacy mainframe that takes 18 months to get something from conception all the way through, then these guys that are going fast are going to have to change their strategy because they know that the features that need to be provided in the back end aren't going to be able to go fast enough. So the problem is, and this is why it's hard, right? This is a business strategy thing. Getting my lunch eaten by competitors that are smaller and nimble in the mobile space, but in order to put competitive features in place, I've got to operate with a legacy mainframe that takes 18 months, right? Can't change this overnight, right? Adopting Scrum and Lean Startup isn't going to make a tightly coupled COBOL mainframe go any faster. Right? So I have to change my strategy up on mobile to compete in a different way relative to the services that I can provide. Maybe I go build some parallel services and then merge them over. You know, there's like just different ways you can think about it. But absolutely, the interaction of expeditions moving through various base camps, when there's dependencies across expeditions, they have to be aware of each other and kind of track the changes. And sometimes that's both have to slow down. Sometimes this can still go fast, but I have to change my expectations based upon the rate that the core services can go. Right? So these are like really unwieldy things, and that's why it gets really complicated. Like as Agilists, we go in and we go, oh, just empower the teams and just do this, and you know the people will figure it out. And like the architects and the business architects and the execs are going, wait a minute, this is a harder problem to solve than just adopting Scrum. Right? And so we have to recognize that this is first and foremost a business architecture problem. There's a great book that we're reading right now as a company by a guy named Charlie Feld. It's about 9 years old. It's called The IT Blind Spot. And it's written to CEOs from a CIO leader, basically talking about having to get business strategy aligned first, business capabilities, business architecture, understanding where the bits of the organization need to live, and then talking about how IT needs to support that, right? What can be loosely coupled, what needs to be highly dependent. And then once you understand your business architecture, how your technology architecture is going to support that, where the dependencies live in the organization, then you can start thinking about what are the right enabling processes and how to move the organization forward. As Agilists, as technologists, we tend to start on the other side and kind of count on that stuff to emerge, right? And I don't think it's doing it. Okay, but then like the next question is, well, how do I get my C-level leaders to do that? And it's just, you know, it's circular.
You had a question over here from you.
Oh, wait, okay, so I'm going to let him tell me like who to talk to next. I apologize.
Hi, my name is Naveen. I work for Macy. My question is, I referred to a metric organization in one of your slides. So my question is, what's your definition of a metric organization from team's perspective?
What's the definition of a what from a team's perspective?
Metric-based organization.
A metrics-based organization. So again, we do whole presentations on metrics, and if we talk a little bit afterwards, got Dennis Stevens here, he's kind of our architect of our metrics program. But when I think about metrics at the team level, they're largely Scrum-based. Do I know my backlog? Do I have backlog, you know, planned out far enough? Is my velocity stable? Do I have escape defects, right? Things like that. As you start to get up into the program and portfolio layers, they start to become more throughput based and start more like how fast are we getting things into market? How quickly can we measure ROI? Are we actually moving the needle in the market? That kind of a thing. Not so much are we delivering on time, on cost, on budget, or on scope, right? But are we actually moving the needle organizationally? That's what I mean by it. Tons of depth underneath it, and we can get you links to whatever if you need it. So
Mike, are you good? I saw a bunch of hands over there. Are you going to be around?
I'm probably going to be around for like another 30 minutes or so, maybe. Ish.
We've got just one of the things that we've got here today. We've got a shortened lunch cycle, so I need to move this on from that.
Okay, cool.
Yeah,
so is this my hook?
Yeah, this
okay.
is your hook.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.